few things more disappointing than coming to the middle of your bouquet season, maybe your spring CSA as a flower grower, and you don't have the filler, you don't have the stock that you had planned on for these bouquets, and they just look sort of pathetic and sad. Is there something you can do to guarantee flowers when you need them all season long? And the answer to that is succession plantings. We have, through a lot of trial and error, kind of figured out what succession plantings we want in our own gardens, and we'll just share that with you today, kind of how we go about it, things to keep in mind when you're planning the succession plantings. But we got to where we are with a lot of trial and error, with just figuring it out, and you're probably going to have to do that too. We wish we could do it for you, but it depends on your growing zone, it depends on the flowers you want, kind of depends on the season too. So we'll share what we know, and hopefully that can help you as well. One thing to keep in mind when you're planning your succession plantings is considering the type of plant you're growing. Some plants are day length sensitive, and what that is that they will only bloom during a certain amount or a certain time in the year when there's a certain amount of light. And I think it's actually, they're sensitive to darkness. I think darkness is what triggers the bloom time, but it's called daylight sensitivity. And some of those, you'll probably be able to maybe get one succession sowing if you do them close together, but if you do them outside of their optimal blooming time, then you're gonna get shorter stems and it's barely worth it. Little anecdote, I had a Rudbeckia that self-seeded, and it was growing in the fall and trying to bloom, and it literally had a 2-inch stem and a regular size head or bloom.
Oh, really?
And so it looked so funny. I saw it in the garden. I think I just laughed right out loud. So day length does matter for bloom times. A few other flowers. So Rudbeckia is one of those. Feverfew, China asters, Campanula, and some sunflowers, I think, their bloom time is triggered by day length. So you'll keep that in mind. If you don't know if your plant that you're trying to succession sow, if you don't know if it's day length sensitive or not, I would say just do a simple internet search. You can find that information pretty easily. Flowers that are not as sensitive to the daylight, those you can plan, multiple successions for, usually without a problem. And just about every annual is also temperature sensitive. We didn't know much about this when we started, and I'm still slowly learning it about some plants. So there's basically two groups of flowers. There's cool hardy and warm season annuals. And they do not like the same growing times. And if you plant a cool hardy flower during the heat of summer, or you want it to bloom during the heat of summer, it just doesn't work that way. I feel like some of the most painful lessons we've learned has been with cool season flowers that we planted too late in the season, hoping to either get a succession or just it was our first planting. We didn't know any better. And they never bloomed. Or if they bloomed, they were just stunted and we couldn't use them. And then warm season annuals obviously will be killed by a frost. So if you plant them too soon, we've done that as well, and they've been toasted. Or you can plant them too late in the season and they don't even have time to start blooming before frost kills them. So keep the temperature sensitivity in mind as well. Some of the flowers that we have grown successfully in succession are celosia and zinnia, cosmos, gomphrena, annual phlox, scabiosa, cress, and basil. And I'm sure there's probably a few more that didn't make the list, but these are all flowers that have, a longer bloom window, if you want to call it that. So planting a succession sowing is probably it'll work out. Some that we're experimenting with this year, we always have to throw a little experiment in there. Foxglove, I'm trying a foxglove experiment because I had foxgloves that self-sowed and then were growing in the middle of summer. I always thought foxgloves had to get established when it was cool, and I think probably most of them do in order to bloom the same year, but I don't know. So I'm planning to try that. We'll see. Lisianthus is another one we're experimenting with, as well as snapdragon, stock, and some sunflowers. I'm the one that's experimenting with stock, but I've already messed up. I saw somewhere you could start them every week and have flowers, which is a bit of overkill for me. I was going to do every 2 weeks. Well, it's been at least 4 weeks since I started my first round, so I might get 2 successions this year. But it's better than last year. I only had 1. So cool hardy flowers might be the easiest way to get into succession sowing for you. I don't know, it might not be the easiest either, but cool hardy flowers are great candidates for this because you can plant
some in the fall, and they will stay sort of small and almost dormant over the winter. And then you can also do a winter sowing indoors and plant that out in the spring. So that gives you 2 successions. And the one that's planted in the fall, I find, usually does the best. It has the biggest stems, the nicest, whatever, but then it's done early. So then the one that I start indoors is then ready to fill in the gap when the first planting is done. If you do that, you'll obviously need to use frost cloth and have some way to keep them from getting completely killed over winter. A lot of these can take a lot of cold. I'll just show you some of the footage from my garden of ones that I did not cover. And you would think that 8 degrees Fahrenheit would kill them, but they look a little bit singed, but they'll be fine. But just be prepared to use some frost cloth if you do the fall planting.
A question we've gotten is how many succession plantings to do, which is a really good question. I think how many depends on what you're growing and the length of your growing season. That has to be pretty specific. I would probably urge you to resist the temptation to grow, 5 succession sowings the first time you're trying it, or something, something crazy. I think we started with 2, maybe 3 when we first started doing succession sowings, and that's a little more manageable. And then I would also say take a lot of notes. When you're doing something for the first time, it's really important to take notes, because even though you can find a lot of information online or from other growers, your own garden, your own zone, your climate, those do really affect how your garden grows. Yeah, take a lot of notes and then just start with a couple successions. And if that works, you can add more the next year. I mean, you can go crazy if you want, but I know I get overwhelmed if I have too many successions to sow, or I did in the beginning. I got pretty overwhelmed with that.
Right. And the reason to do this is to have flowers when you need them. And sometimes we planted successions that we weren't even going to need.
Right.
So it's we call it Goldilocksing it. You want to right size it.
Right.
Try to get just as much as you need, not too much more.
Yeah. Which reminds me, last year I had a lemon basil planting that I was hoping to have ready for some bouquets in September, but basil is pretty tender, and we had a really cold night that didn't zap. It wasn't a frost, but it was cold enough that the basil turned brown. And so I was like, I didn't use a single stalk on that whole planting. But
that's a
it's
bummer.
okay. I was pushing it. If you're planning for basil in September, that's a little, I knew it.
So how frequently should you sow your successions? And that depends on the flower, obviously. Some of our successions are 2 weeks. I don't know if I have any that are 2 weeks. I'm lucky if I get 4. But typically I think they would recommend anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks between plantings. And the ones that you would start more frequently are the ones that only bloom once, like stock and pro-cut sunflowers. If you want to keep having those throughout the season, you're going to need to start them, every week or every 2 weeks. But then stuff like zinnias, stuff that's cut and come again, you want to do 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It just kind of depends on how they grow in your garden. We tend to struggle with mildew, so I like to have a fresh batch ready to go when the first one succumbs to mildew, put it that way. Just a note here too that your mom or your grandma may have planted just 1 row of zinnias and picked from them all summer long. So why do you need to start more than 1? You don't. Obviously, if you don't want to, don't do it. But I think that the best blooms from zinnias are from the first 2 or 3 cuttings off of a plant. And then I think after that, mine just start going downhill. I don't know if it's just me, but I like to have sort of fresh ones ready to go after that.
I think there is something to that. And I think even the color can kind of change. And I'm not sure is that to do with an older plant or if it's just warmer. I think you're right. One more thing to keep in mind when you're planning your successions is what's your first frost date in the fall. And that most annuals, and succession sowing is done with annuals because you can manipulate, bloom times and stuff a little bit that way. Most annuals will die with the first frost. And so if you have something ready to bloom right before that, you've wasted that time, that energy, planting those. Let's take zinnias, for example. They take about 90 days to reach maturity. And if I want them to bloom for, let's say, at least 3 weeks, then I'm going to have to find my first frost date, which is typically the first part of October, go back 3 months, and then also go back 3 weeks more if I want them to be, blooming for a while before frost. So for me in zone 6A here, I won't plant zinnias after middle of June is typically the last I would plant any, zinnia seeds. And it can vary, from variety to variety and even from year to year. Sometimes they'll bloom into October a ways. But I just know, I'm not going to plan successions too late because then we're going to run into frost and I won't be able to use the flowers.
Doing too late in the spring, if you plant them too late in the spring, the summer heat will kill the spring flowers.
Right.
And if you plant the warm flowers too late in the fall, the cool will kill the warm flowers.
Right.
So, yeah,
Again,
don't do a lot of work that you don't need to do.
Right. Right sizing it, like you like to say.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So how do we end it?
Let me see.
We wish you a successful succession year.